You're just the family's maid, Margaret. So after today, pack your things and find somewhere else to go." Jason said it loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, like he was making a toast instead of erasing me from my own life. And I remember the way the ice in his glass clinked as he took a sip, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that wasn't supposed to be argued with. And for a moment, no one spoke, not even my daughter Emily, who sat to his right staring down at her plate, as if the pattern on the china had suddenly become the most important thing in the world. And I felt something settle inside me, not break, not shatter, just settle, like dust after a door has been slammed. And I smiled. Just a small one, the kind you give strangers at the grocery store, because they had no idea what I had already done that morning. Labor Day had always been my favorite holiday, not because of the sales or the long weekend, but because it was the one day every year when I insisted the whole family come together. No excuses, no last-minute cancellations, just food, laughter, and the comfort of being needed. And I had woken up at 6 that morning, the same way I always did, even though no one else in the house stirred until nearly 9. And I moved quietly through the kitchen, tying on the same faded apron I'd worn for years. The one Emily used to joke made me look like something out of an old magazine. And I prepared everything myself. The grilled chicken marinated overnight, the corn brushed with butter, the potato salad chilled just right, because that's what I did. I made things easier for everyone else. I filled in the gaps. I kept the rhythm of the house steady, even after my husband passed 3 years ago, and everything should have fallen apart. After he died, Emily asked me to move in with them, said she didn't want me to be alone, said the house would feel fuller with me there. And I believed her. I packed up 32 years of memories into boxes and brought only what I thought I'd need. A few photo albums, my clothes, and the small wooden jewelry box my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary. And I told myself I was lucky to have a daughter who cared, lucky to have a place where I belonged. And for a while, it felt true. I helped with the cooking, the cleaning, watched my grandson after school, folded laundry that was never mine, and listened to conversations that didn't include me. And I didn't mind, not at first, because being useful felt close enough to being loved. But over time, something shifted, not all at once, not in a way you could point to and say, "There." That's when it changed, but in small, quiet ways, like doors that used to stay open now being closed, like conversations that stopped when I entered the room, like the way Jason would hand me his empty plate without looking at me, as if it was understood that I would take it, wash it, return it to its place. And I told myself I was imagining it. That grief made everything feel heavier than it was, that families changed, that I just needed to adjust. And so I did. I adjusted to the silence, to the distance, to the way my name was used less and less, replaced by small requests. "Can you do this? Can you take care of that?" Until one afternoon, I realized something that should have been obvious much sooner. I wasn't living with my family anymore. I was working for them, just without a paycheck, and still, I stayed, because leaving would have meant admitting I no longer had a place to go. That morning, before the sun had fully risen, before the coffee finished brewing, I picked up my purse, slipped on my shoes, and walked out the front door without waking anyone. The air was cool, the kind that makes you feel awake whether you want to be or not. And I drove across town with a quiet purpose I hadn't felt in years, because something inside me had finally stopped waiting for things to go back to the way they were, and started preparing for what they had become. And by the time I returned, setting the table like nothing had changed, arranging plates and glasses with the same careful precision, I already knew how this day would end. I just didn't know they would make it so easy. I did not argue with him, not because I agreed, but because I had already learned that the loudest people in a room are often the least prepared for silence. And so I reached for my glass of iced tea, took a small sip, and set it back down carefully, as if nothing of importance had just been said. And across from me, Jason leaned back in his chair with that same satisfied expression he always wore when he believed he had control of a situation. His arm draped casually over the back of Emily's chair like he owned not just the house, but everyone inside it. And Emily still did not look at me, her fingers twisting the edge of her napkin in a way I recognized from when she was a child and knew she had done something wrong but did not want to admit it. And for a brief second, I wondered if she would say something, anything, to soften what had just happened, but she did not, and that told me more than any words ever could. The rest of the table stayed quiet. My grandson continued eating, unaware, or perhaps simply used to the tone that had become normal in this house. And the sound of silverware against plates filled the space where a family should have been, and I realized then that this moment was not sudden. It was simply the first time it had been spoken out loud, the first time the truth had not bothered to hide itself behind polite smiles and careful phrasing. "I think that is enough," I said finally, my voice calm, steady, almost gentle, and Jason let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if I had just confirmed exactly what he expected. "That is right, Margaret. It is enough. You have done enough here," he replied, and there was something in the way he said my name, something dismissive, like it no longer carried any weight, and I nodded once, as if we were in agreement, because in a way, we were, just not in the way he believed. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my blouse, a small habit I had developed over the years whenever I needed a moment to think, and I began clearing the table, collecting plates one by one, not because anyone asked me to, but because that was the role they had assigned me, and for the first time, I was aware of how easily I could step out of it. As I carried the dishes into the kitchen, I could hear Jason's voice continue behind me, lower now, speaking to Emily about timelines, about space, about what they were going to do once I was gone, as if I were already nothing more than an inconvenience being scheduled out of their lives. And I placed each plate in the sink with deliberate care, rinsing them under warm water, watching the remnants of the meal disappear down the drain. And I thought about all the meals before this one, all the quiet afternoons, all the moments I had convinced myself were acts of love rather than obligation, and how easy it had been to confuse the two when you wanted something to be true badly enough. When I returned to the dining room, Jason barely glanced at me, already moving on, already certain the conversation was over, but I picked up my purse from the chair where I had left it earlier, the same purse I had carried with me that morning, and I held it in both hands for a second, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, not obvious, just enough to remind me of what was inside. And then I looked at Emily, really looked at her, and for the first time that day, she met my eyes, and there was something there, something like hesitation, maybe even regret, but it was quiet, too quiet to matter anymore. "I will go upstairs and start packing," I said, and my voice did not shake, it did not rise, it did not carry any of the emotion they might have expected, and Jason nodded immediately, relieved, as if compliance was the best outcome he could have hoped for. "That would be best," he said, already reaching for his phone, already distracted, and I turned toward the staircase, taking each step slowly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt to leave this part of my life behind. And as I reached the top, I paused for just a moment, my hand resting on the railing, and I allowed myself one final thought, not of anger, not of sadness, but of clarity, the kind that comes when everything finally makes sense. And then I walked into my room, closed the door behind me, and smiled again, this time not for them, but for what was coming next. I closed the bedroom door softly behind me, the same way I had done every night for the past 3 years, but this time the sound felt different, more final, as if it marked the end of something that had already been gone for a long time. And I stood there for a moment, looking around the room that had slowly stopped feeling like mine, the dresser with fewer items than it once held, the closet where my clothes had been pushed to one side to make space for things that did not belong to me, the small nightstand where my husband's photo still sat, untouched, like a quiet witness to everything that had unfolded since he was gone. And I walked over to it, picking up the frame and running my fingers lightly over the edge, remembering a time when this house had been filled with a different kind of silence, one that felt peaceful instead of empty. I set the photo carefully into my suitcase, placing it between folded sweaters, not because I was in a hurry, but because I had already decided what mattered enough to take with me, and what could be left behind without regret. And as I moved around the room, opening drawers, selecting only what I needed, I found myself thinking back to that morning, to the quiet drive across town, to the way the early sunlight had stretched across the dashboard, as if guiding me somewhere I had been avoiding for far too long. The bank had been nearly empty when I arrived, just one teller behind the counter and a man in a gray suit waiting near the offices, and I remember how steady my hands felt as I signed my name, how clear everything had seemed once the words were spoken out loud, once the documents were placed in front of me, Once the polite woman across the desk confirmed what I had begun to suspect weeks ago, that the accounts I thought were shared had been altered, that the signatures I did not remember, making had appeared where they should not have been, and that someone inside my own family had been moving pieces around me as if I would never notice. I had not raised my voice then either, had not accused anyone, had simply listened, asked questions, and then made the necessary changes, one signature at a time, one quiet decision after another, until everything that belonged to me was once again exactly where it should be, secure, untouchable, and no longer within anyone else's reach. And when I left the bank, I did not feel angry. I felt something far more useful. I felt prepared. Back in the bedroom, I zipped up the first suitcase and set it by the door, then reached for the second, smaller one, the one I used for short trips, and I placed inside it the items I would need immediately, my medications, a few personal documents, and the envelope I had picked up before leaving the bank, the one I had not opened yet, not because I was afraid of what it contained, but because I already knew it would be exactly what I needed at the right moment, and I preferred to keep some things sealed until they were meant to be seen. Downstairs, I could still hear the faint murmur of voices, Jason's confident tone, Emily's quieter responses, the occasional sound of laughter that felt out of place given what had just happened, and I paused for a second, listening, not with sadness, but with a kind of distance I had never allowed myself before, as if I were hearing strangers in a house I no longer lived in. And I realized then that leaving was not the loss I had feared, it was simply the next step. I picked up the suitcases, one in each hand, and carried them toward the door, moving carefully down the stairs, each step measured, each movement deliberate, and when I reached the bottom, both of them looked up, surprised perhaps that I had moved so quickly, or maybe that I had returned at all, and I placed the suitcases by the front door, straightened my posture, and looked at them both with a calm I had earned, not borrowed. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was being asked to leave. I felt like I was choosing to go, and that made all the difference. I did not rush to the door, even though everything was already packed, because there is a difference between leaving in a hurry and leaving on your own terms, and I had waited too long in my life to confuse the two again. So I rested my hand lightly on the handle of my suitcase and looked at Jason first, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with the kind of calm attention you give someone when you are finally seeing them clearly for the first time. And he shifted slightly in his chair, just enough to show that my silence was making him uncomfortable, even if he would never admit it out loud. And then I turned to Emily, my daughter, the girl I had once stayed up all night with when she had a fever, the one whose hand I held on her first day of school, the one I believed would always recognize me no matter how much time passed. And for a brief moment, I saw something flicker across her face, something uncertain, something almost like the beginning of a question, but it faded just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same quiet distance that had been growing between us for years. "You do not need to worry about packing anything else," I said, my voice even, measured, as if I were discussing something as simple as the weather, and Jason let out a short breath that almost sounded like relief. "Good. That makes things easier," he replied, already stepping mentally into the version of the future he had planned, one where I was no longer part of the picture. One where every room in this house would finally belong to him without interruption, and I nodded slightly, because in that, at least, he was right. It would make things easier, just not in the way he imagined. I reached into my purse then, slowly, deliberately, and I felt the smooth edge of the envelope beneath my fingers, the same envelope I had carried with me since that morning, and I held it there for a second without taking it out, not as a dramatic pause, but as a quiet acknowledgement of how much can change in a single day when you decide to stop ignoring what is right in front of you. And then I let my hand rest again, leaving the envelope where it was, because timing, I had learned, was not about speed, it was about precision. "Before I go," I continued, meeting Jason's eyes again, "there is just one thing I want to make clear," and he leaned back slightly, his expression tightening just enough to show that this was not part of the script he had written in his head. And Emily looked between us, her fingers still twisting the fabric of her napkin, as if she could unravel the situation by pulling at its edges. "You will not need to worry about me anymore," I said, and there was a softness in my tone that could have been mistaken for surrender if someone was not listening closely. Not about my expenses, not about my space, not about anything at all. And Jason gave a small, satisfied nod, taking my words at face value, accepting them as confirmation that everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned. And for a moment, I let him have that, because there is a certain kind of lesson that can only be learned when someone is allowed to believe they have already won. I picked up my purse, adjusted the strap on my shoulder, and walked toward the front door, each step steady, unhurried. And as I reached for the handle, I paused just long enough to glance back one more time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember this moment exactly as it was. The room, the table, the people who had decided what I was worth without ever asking me. And I realized then that nothing about this house had changed at all, only my understanding of it had, and that was enough. I opened the door, letting the late afternoon light spill into the hallway, warm and steady, and I stepped outside with my suitcases in hand, the air carrying the distant sound of neighbors enjoying the holiday, laughter, music, the ordinary rhythms of a day that meant something different to everyone else. And I walked down the path without looking back again, because I did not need to see what I had already left behind. And as I reached the sidewalk, I allowed myself one final thought, quiet and certain, not a question, not a doubt, but a simple truth that settled into place with the same calm certainty I had felt all day. They believed they had taken everything from me, but in reality, they had just given me the perfect reason to take it all back. I did not stop walking until I reached the end of the block, not because I was afraid they would call me back, but because I wanted to feel the distance grow with each step, to let the air change around me, to remind myself that leaving was not the same as being pushed out. And when I finally set my suitcases down beside the curb, I took a slow breath and looked around. The neighborhood quiet except for the occasional sound of a lawn mower in the distance and the faint echo of laughter from a nearby backyard. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not loneliness, not fear, but space, the kind that allows you to think clearly without someone else's voice filling in the silence. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had saved just that morning, the one labeled simply as Harrison Law Office, and I pressed call without hesitation, holding the phone to my ear as it rang once, then twice, before a calm, professional voice answered on the other end, and I introduced myself, not as someone asking for help, but as someone confirming the next step in a plan that had already been set in motion. "Everything is finalized," he said after I explained where I was, his tone steady, reassuring. "The accounts have been secured, the property is legally protected, and any unauthorized changes made previously have been reversed and documented." And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting those words settle, not because I doubted them, but because hearing them out loud made everything feel real in a way that quiet preparation never could. "Good," I replied simply, and there was a pause on the line, as if he expected more, but there was nothing else to say, not yet, because some actions do not need to be announced in advance. They only need to be carried out at the right time. And I thanked him, ended the call, and slipped the phone back into my purse with the same calm precision I had carried throughout the day. A car passed by slowly, the driver glancing at me for a second before continuing on, and I realized how I must have looked, a woman standing alone with 2 suitcases on a holiday afternoon, as if I had nowhere to go. And for a brief moment, I let that image exist, not to feel sorry for myself, but to understand how easily appearances can be mistaken for truth, because the reality was far different from what anyone could see from the outside. I picked up my suitcases again and walked toward the corner, where I had arranged earlier for a car to meet me. Not a last-minute decision, but something planned with the same quiet care as everything else I had done that day. And when the car pulled up, right on time, I placed my bags in the trunk and slid into the back seat, giving the driver the address without needing to look it up, because I had already memorized it, already imagined what it would feel like to arrive somewhere that belonged entirely to me again. As the car pulled away from the curb, I glanced out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, each one holding pieces of a life I had spent years trying to preserve, and I realized that nothing about those places had changed, only my role within them had, and that was something I could choose not to carry forward. The envelope in my purse shifted slightly as the car turned, and I rested my hand over it, feeling the outline through the fabric, not opening it yet, not rushing the moment, because I understood now that control was not about reacting quickly. It was about knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. And for now, waiting was still part of the plan. The driver asked if the temperature was comfortable, and I nodded, my voice soft but certain as I thanked him, and I leaned back into the seat, letting the movement of the car carry me forward, away from what I had left behind, and towards something I had not allowed myself to consider until now. A life that was no longer defined by what others expected from me, but by what I chose to do next. And as the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road ahead, I allowed myself one small, quiet thought, not of revenge, not of regret, but of timing, because the day was not over yet, and neither was I. The car came to a slow stop in front of a quiet building set back from the street, its exterior simple, clean, almost unremarkable in a way that felt intentional, as if it had nothing to prove to anyone passing by, and I stepped out carefully, the evening air cooler now, carrying that subtle shift that happens when a day is nearing its end, but something else is just beginning, and the driver retrieved my suitcases without a word, placing them neatly on the sidewalk before offering a polite nod, and I thanked him, my voice steady, before watching the car disappear down the street, leaving me alone in a place that did not carry a single memory of who I used to be. I stood there for a moment, taking in the quiet, the absence of noise, the absence of expectation, and I realized how long it had been since I had felt this kind of stillness without it being filled by someone else's needs, and I reached into my purse again, this time taking out the envelope I had carried with me all day, the paper smooth beneath my fingers, sealed but no longer waiting, and I opened it slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it represented. Inside were copies of documents, clean, official, undeniable, statements of ownership, confirmations of transfers, signatures that were mine and mine alone, each page a quiet correction of everything that had been quietly taken from me over the past months. And as I read through them, standing there under the soft glow of the streetlight, I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of anger, just a calm understanding that the balance had already shifted, that everything they believed they controlled had already been returned to where it belonged. The front door of the building opened with a soft click, and a woman stepped out, perhaps in her early 50s, dressed neatly, her expression warm but not intrusive, and she greeted me by name as if we had known each other for years, though this was the first time we had met, and I realized then that everything about this place had been arranged with care, not just the address, not just the timing, but the transition itself, quiet, seamless, deliberate. "We have your unit ready," she said, her voice calm, and I nodded, picking up one of my suitcases while she took the other without hesitation, leading the way inside. And as I crossed the threshold, I felt something settle again, not the weight I had felt earlier, but something lighter, something steady, like placing a final piece into a space that had been waiting for it. The hallway was quiet, softly lit, the kind of place where footsteps did not echo loudly, and we moved at an unhurried pace until we reached a door near the end, and she opened it, stepping aside to let me enter first, and I did, pausing just inside to take in the space. A small living area, a kitchen that had never been used by anyone else, a window that looked out onto a row of trees instead of a street filled with expectations. And I set my suitcase down gently, not because it was heavy, but because I understood that this moment did not need to be rushed. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said, placing the second suitcase near the wall before giving me a small, respectful smile and leaving me alone, and the door closed softly behind her, sealing the space in a quiet that belonged entirely to me. I walked over to the window, setting the envelope on the table beside it, and I looked out at the fading light, the sky shifting into deeper shades as the day finally gave way to evening, and I allowed myself to stand there without moving, without thinking about what had been said earlier, without replaying the conversation at the table, because those moments no longer required my attention, they had already served their purpose. I reached for my phone once more, not to call for help, not to ask for anything, but to check the time, and I saw that it was still early enough, that the day had not yet fully ended, and I considered, just for a moment, how things might be unfolding back at the house, whether the absence had been noticed yet, whether the quiet had shifted in a way they could not quite explain, and I set the phone down again without calling, because some realizations are far more powerful when they arrive. without warning, without explanation, and I preferred to let that happen exactly as it was meant to. I picked up the envelope once more, sliding the documents back inside, placing it neatly on the table, and I sat down for the first time since leaving, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my posture relaxed but certain, and I let the silence fill the room, not empty, not lonely, but complete, and I understood then that everything that needed to be done had already been set in motion, and all that remained was to let it unfold. I did not turn on the lights right away, because the dim glow from the window was enough, and there was something about letting the room remain half in shadow that made everything feel quieter, more deliberate, as if I had stepped into a place where nothing needed to be explained, and I sat there for a while, listening to the soft hum of the building, the distant sound of someone closing a door down the hall, the kind of small, ordinary noises that remind you life continues whether you are ready for it or not. And I let my hands rest loosely in my lap, not reaching for anything, not searching for distraction, just allowing the stillness to settle into me in a way it had not been able to before. It was not until my phone vibrated against the table that I moved again, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and I glanced down at the screen, seeing Emily's name appear, followed by a second call almost immediately after the first ended, and I watched it without answering, not out of spite, not to prove a point, but because I understood that whatever was happening on the other end of that call had already begun without me, and I did not need to rush back into it to understand its meaning. The phone stopped, then started again, and this time a message appeared instead, short, uncertain, asking where I was, asking if I had really left, and I read it once, then set the phone face down on the table, not responding, because some questions are not meant to be answered right away, especially when the person asking them has spent so long ignoring the ones that mattered. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen, opening the cabinet to find it empty except for a single glass, still wrapped in protective paper, untouched, and I unwrapped it carefully, filling it with water from the sink, the sound of it running steady and calm, and I took a sip, letting the coolness settle, grounding me in the present moment instead of pulling me back into what had already been decided. When I returned to the main room, I picked up the envelope again, sliding one of the documents out just enough to see the official seal at the top, the confirmation that everything had been restored, every account, every title, every detail that had been quietly shifted behind my back now corrected with the same quiet precision. And I thought about how easily it must have seemed to them, how simple it must have felt to move things around without telling me, to assume I would not notice, to believe that age meant inattention, that silence meant ignorance, and I almost smiled at the simplicity of that assumption. My phone vibrated again, and this time I picked it up, not to answer, but to observe, and there were more messages now, longer ones, questions turning into confusion, confusion turning into urgency, and I could almost hear the shift in tone without needing to listen to a single word, because realization has a rhythm to it, a pace that quickens as pieces begin to fall into place. And I imagined the moment they would start to understand, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the ground move beneath them in a way they had not expected. I set the phone down once more and walked back to the window, looking out at the darkening sky, the last light fading behind the trees, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was not waiting for something to happen. I was not hoping for someone to change. I was not adjusting myself to fit into a space that had already decided I did not belong. I was simply standing still, letting everything else catch up to a truth that had already been set in motion. Somewhere, miles away, in a house that no longer held any claim over me, conversations were unfolding, questions being asked, answers being searched for in places they had never thought to look before, and I knew that soon enough, they would begin to understand that what they believed they had taken had never truly been theirs to control, and that realization would arrive quietly, without warning, just as everything else had. And I remained exactly where I was, calm, steady, and completely certain that I no longer needed to be present to witness it unfold. The room remained quiet, but the silence was no longer passive. It felt like something waiting, something holding its breath just beneath the surface, and I stood by the window a little longer, watching the last traces of daylight disappear, until the reflection in the glass became clearer than what was outside. And for a moment I saw myself the way they must have seen me all those years, small, convenient, someone who would adjust, someone who would stay, and I almost smiled at how easy that version of me had been to believe in. My phone vibrated again, this time longer, more persistent, and I picked it up, not with urgency, but with intention, and I answered without speaking, letting the silence carry across the line first, because silence has a way of revealing more than words ever can. Mom. Emily's voice came through, tight, uncertain, the way it used to sound when she was younger and had broken something she did not know how to fix, and I could hear movement behind her, the faint echo of Jason speaking in the background, his voice lower now, no longer confident, no longer in control of the tone he had set earlier, and I waited, giving her the space to say what she had called to say. "Where are you?" she asked, and I could hear the shift in her voice, the edge of something unfamiliar, something that had not been there before, and I glanced down at the envelope resting on the table, my fingers brushing lightly over it, as if it were simply another object in the room, not the center of everything that was about to unfold. "I am exactly where I need to be," I said calmly, and there was a pause on the line, longer this time, and then Jason's voice came closer, sharper, trying to regain its earlier certainty. "Margaret, we need to talk about what just happened," he said, and I could almost picture him standing there, phone in hand, expecting me to step back into the role he had assigned me, expecting me to respond the way I always had before. But I did not move, not physically, not emotionally, because I no longer needed to. "There is nothing left to discuss," I replied, my voice even. Not raised, not defensive, just clear, and I heard the faint sound of papers being moved on the other end, drawers opening, the subtle shift of a room that was no longer behaving the way they expected it to. And Emily spoke again, faster now, her words overlapping slightly. "Something is wrong. The accounts, the access, Jason cannot." She stopped herself, as if realizing too late what she had just admitted, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition. Because this was the moment I had anticipated, the moment when confusion would begin to replace certainty. "You should check everything carefully," I said quietly, and I let the words settle, not offering explanation, not filling in the gaps, because understanding is far more powerful when it is discovered rather than delivered. And there was another pause, followed by the sound of Jason again, this time lower, strained, asking questions that no longer had immediate answers, and I imagined him moving through the house, opening drawers, checking documents, realizing piece by piece that what he thought he controlled had already been moved beyond his reach long before he ever decided to speak. "What did you do?" he asked finally, and the question hung there, heavier than anything he had said earlier that day, stripped of its earlier confidence, and I opened my eyes, looking out at the darkness beyond the glass, where nothing could be clearly seen, but everything still existed exactly as it was. "I corrected what was never yours to change," I answered, and I could feel the shift on the other end of the line, not just in the words, but in the silence that followed, the kind that comes when someone realizes the ground beneath them is no longer stable, and I did not need to say anything more, because the rest would unfold on its own. Emily's voice returned, softer now, almost unsteady. "Mom, we did not mean," she began, but I did not let her finish, not out of anger, but because some sentences do not need to be completed to be understood, and I ended the call gently, placing the phone back on the table with the same care I had used for everything else that day. The room returned to silence, but it felt different now, fuller, as if something invisible had shifted into place, and I walked back to the chair, sitting down slowly, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and I allowed myself to breathe, steady and unhurried, because there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove. Everything that needed to be done had already been done, and somewhere far away, in a house that had once defined my place in the world, the truth was finally beginning to take shape in a way that could no longer be ignored. The silence after the call did not feel heavy. It felt complete, like the final note of a song that had stretched longer than it should have, and I remained seated for a while, not because I needed to recover, but because I finally understood that there was nothing left to prepare for, nothing left to anticipate. Everything that had once been uncertain had already settled into place, and I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting my shoulders relax in a way they had not in years, as if I had been carrying something invisible that I had only just set down. Outside, the night had fully arrived. the window now reflecting only the room behind me, and I could see the outline of the small space I now occupied. Simple, quiet, entirely mine, and I realized how little I actually needed to feel grounded. Not a large house, not a crowded table, not the constant motion of other people's lives, just a place where my presence was not conditional, where my value was not measured by how much I could give without being asked. My phone remained still on the table. No new calls, no new messages, and I knew why. Not because they had nothing left to say, but because they had begun to understand that words would no longer shape the outcome, that whatever control they believed they had was already gone, and I did not feel the need to check, to confirm, to revisit what had already been decided, because closure does not always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from silence that is finally respected. I stood up slowly and walked back to the suitcase near the wall, opening it with deliberate care, not unpacking everything at once, just taking out a few items, placing them where they belonged, a sweater folded neatly over the chair, my shoes set by the door, the photograph of my husband placed on the small table beside the window, and I paused there for a moment, looking at it, not with sadness, but with a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had come before, the life we had built, the promises we had made, and the ways in which I had tried to honor them even when things had begun to shift beyond my control. I did not lose anything, I said softly, not to anyone in particular, but because sometimes hearing the truth out loud makes it settle more firmly. And I let the words exist in the room without needing to explain them further, because they were not meant for anyone else to understand, only for me to accept. I moved back toward the window once more, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the table, and I looked out into the darkness, knowing that somewhere beyond it, in a place I no longer needed to return to, everything was still unfolding, questions still being asked, answers still being uncovered piece by piece, and I felt no urgency to witness it, no desire to correct or guide or explain, because the most important part of that story had already happened without me being there, and that was enough. I turned away from the window then, taking in the room one last time before reaching for the light switch and turning it on, filling the space with a soft, steady glow, and the shift was immediate, not dramatic, but clear, the room no longer a temporary place, no longer a transition, but something real, something that belonged to me without condition or expectation, and I understood then that this was not an ending, not in the way I had once feared. It was simply a return, not to what had been, but to something I had almost forgotten I still had, the ability to stand on my own without needing permission, without needing validation, without needing to prove my place in someone else's life. I picked up the envelope from the table and placed it neatly in the drawer beside the bed, not hidden, not discarded, just set aside, because its purpose had already been fulfilled, and I no longer needed to carry it with me. And as I lay down, pulling the blanket over myself, I allowed my eyes to close, not with exhaustion, but with a calm certainty that did not need to be questioned, because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to wait for, nothing left to fix, nothing left to endure, only what came next, and I would meet it exactly as I was, not as they had seen me, not as I had once allowed myself to be, but as someone who had finally remembered that she was never just a part of someone else's story. She was always the one who decided how it would end. On a quiet holiday meant for family and togetherness, a mother finds herself humiliated and cast aside by her own son-in-law while her daughter remains silent, revealing the painful truth behind many family stories where love is replaced by convenience and respect is quietly taken for granted. This deeply emotional narrative follows an elderly mother who devoted her life to caring for her family, only to be reduced to a role she never agreed to, exposing the hidden dynamics that exist in many family stories and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim dignity without raising one's voice. As the story unfolds, the mother begins to see the patterns she once ignored, the subtle manipulation, the emotional distance, and the calculated decisions made behind her back, all of which mirror the harsh realities often explored in family stories that resonate with audiences who understand betrayal within the home. While the son-in-law believes he has full control and the daughter struggles between guilt and silence, the mother quietly takes steps to protect what is rightfully hers, demonstrating a level of awareness and resilience that transforms this from a story of loss into one of empowerment. a theme that defines the most compelling family stories told through a calm yet powerful voice. Without confrontation or chaos, she reclaims her independence, leaving behind not just a house, but a role that never truly belonged to her, proving that strength does not always appear loud or dramatic, but often reveals itself in silence, timing, and clarity, making this one of those unforgettable family stories where the real turning point happens long before anyone else realizes it. In the end, as truth begins to surface and control shifts away from those who believe they held it, the mother stands alone but not broken, embodying the quiet authority that comes from knowing one's worth. A conclusion that captures the essence of meaningful family stories and leaves a lasting impression on anyone who has ever felt unseen within their own family. Character 1 is a 68-year-old white American woman with natural aging features and calm expression. She wears modest, neat clothing and stands facing forward. Realistic lighting and texture. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Serious emotional presence and quiet strength. Character 2 is a 40-year-old white American man with sharp, confident facial features and controlled expression. He wears a clean-fitted shirt and stands facing forward. Realistic lighting and texture. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Subtle arrogance and dominance.